They tried to erase his name from the stars, but tonight we write it back. In the heart of a shattered empire, beneath a sky no longer owned by tyrants, a woman stands before the galaxy not as a slave, not as a fugitive, but as a mother, a singer of stars, and the voice of the future. 3 years after Raylan's sacrifice, Seyla returns not to mourn, but to awaken. And when her son lifts the flame toward the heavens, igniting a constellation in his father's name, the room falls silent. Because in that moment, the universe remembers what love can do. And freedom? It sings back. This story began with a cage, but ends in Constellation. The door sealed behind them with a muted hiss, and the silence that followed was thick, like the vacuum between stars, holding everything and nothing. Raylan stood still for a moment, his breath slow, measured. The imperial walls of his quarters were clean, orderly, and deceivingly sterile. Yet beneath the polished steel and humming lights, the room pulsed with secrets. He reached into the back panel of his desk-silent fingers, flipping a false compartment in, disabled the embedded surveillance grid with a practiced motion. One by one, the glowing eyes of the ceiling blinked out, until only ambient light remained, dim and watchful. She watched him, not with fear, no, that had already burned out somewhere along the line, but with the kind of calm that came from knowing too much sorrow too soon. Seyla's posture remained rigid, wrists still bound in the Empire's cruel alloy bands, her chin lifted not in pride, but defiance unbroken. Raylan turned, slowly, carefully, and then he knelt. "I imagine you already know Standard," he said, not as a question, but a bridge. She nodded once, eyes narrowing not at the words, but the way he said them. He wasn't commanding, he wasn't posturing. He was asking. Without waiting for her response, Raylan moved to the warmer at his side panel. A small tray emerged, a bowl of steaming broth, some fruit, a water flask, all real. Not rations. Not processed sustenance, real. The room filled with the scent of warmth, subtle herbs, and something else. Something unexpected. Compassion. He set the tray down on the edge of the low table and gestured gently toward it. "Eat if you want, rest if you can. No one's watching but me." She didn't move. He stepped closer, opened his palm, and from it, a tiny control node. One click. The collar around her neck hissed, then unlocked with a soft chime, falling away like a dead thing. A faint line of heat still glowed where it had burned into her skin. She flinched not from pain, but from the sudden absence of restraint, a phantom weight that had wrapped her like a second spine now gone. Her fingers instinctively rose to her throat, brushing the skin where the collar had been. Her voice came then, low, clear, and unshaken. "You're not afraid of treason?" Raylan exhaled, but it wasn't a laugh, only of silence. Their eyes met. For the first time, as equals. She sat, not because he told her to, but because she chose to. There was something in the way she moved now deliberate, slow, fluid as if unlearning captivity in real time. She reached for the cup with hands still raw from shackles and brought it to her lips. Her first sip trembled, not from weakness, but from memory of times when food meant more than survival, when it had flavor, when it had meaning. He watched her not the way a soldier observes a target, but like someone who had never truly seen another person until this moment. "My name is Raylan," he said. "Captain, until about 5 minutes ago." She tilted her head. Her voice, when it came again, held the rhythm of starlight and sorrow. "Seyla, navigator, until they destroyed my world." A pause. "They said I was valuable, that my blood was rare, my womb adaptable." Raylan clenched his fist beneath the table. "I'm not going to do what they told me. I won't treat you like something made to serve me, or them." "And what will you do?" His answer came with no hesitation. "Whatever you ask." For a long while, they simply breathed the same air. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unsaid truths and distant echoes. The sound of two lives diverging from their programmed paths. Seyla studied him. "You knew what they expected of you." "I did. And yet you disobey." "I didn't disobey the Empire," he said slowly. "I disobeyed myself, the version of me who would have followed orders. He died the moment I saw you walk into that office." The light shifted. From the overhead panels, a low hum vibrated through the walls, like a whisper reminder that outside this room, the machine still turned, still processed, still bred and burned. But here, in this breath of stillness, something else had taken root, something unwelcome in the halls of conquest. A choice. He reached for the second flask and offered it to her. This time, she took it. Her eyes lingered on him now, not in suspicion, but in curiosity, cautious yet alive. There was no romance here, no seduction, only raw, delicate truth. She glanced at the door, then back at him. They'll come for you. For this. I know. And you'll lose everything. He nodded. I already lost what mattered before today. My conscience, my soul. You gave it back the moment you looked at me like I was more than a uniform. Seyla leaned back, her body relaxing by degrees, like the tension was seeping out through her fingertips. A storm had passed, but another brewed just beyond the hull. Outside, the stars hung like ancient witnesses, burning quietly in their distant watch. Inside, two beings no longer tethered to the Empire's chain sat in shared silence, not master and captive and not soldier and specimen but as something else. As the light dimmed and the ship slipped into hyperspace, Seyla closed her eyes. She did not sleep, not yet. But for the first time since her capture, she did not listen for footsteps in the dark. She listened to the quiet and chose to stay. The door slid shut behind them with a hush-like breath held too long. The lights dimmed, not by command, but by the room's designant unspoken instinct to cloak secrets in shadow. This was no ordinary chamber aboard the ship, no windows, no cameras. Only the low pulse of hidden circuits in the walls and the soft drone of a deep power core below. It smelled faintly of ozone, old electronics, and forgotten things not meant to be found. Raylan stepped ahead, boots echoing softly against the grated floor. Each footfall felt like an intrusion. The room wasn't large, but it carried the gravity of a cathedral, quiet, heavy, reverent. On the far wall, a single console flickered with aged light, not the sterile blue of Imperial tech, but a deeper, hue-greenish, unstable, like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe longer. Seyla hesitated at the threshold. "Where are we?" she asked, voice still raw from silence, though steadier than before. Raylan glanced back at her. His eyes didn't carry arrogance or certainty, only resolve. The hidden vault, level 3, deep archive, off-grid since the Archeon incident. He paused. It's where they bury what they can't justify. He activated the console with a passkey older than most captains on the fleet. The machine groaned awake like something ancient stirred from a dream. A flicker of light danced across the ceiling, casting fractured holograms into the air-spinning star charts. Fragmented reports, layers of encrypted history. And then, the screen settled on a file marked with red glyphs. Seyla's breath caught in her chest. That symbol. She knew it. She'd seen it carved onto the walls of burned villages, etched into the helmets of her people's executioners. Raylan didn't look at her. Not yet. His fingers moved across the interface, disabling locks, peeling back layers of security like peeling skin from a wound. When the footage started, there was no music, no narration, just raw, cold recordings. A Lasari settlement, beautiful, crystalline, built in spiraling forms that danced with light. The structures shimmered like frost under twin suns. Children floated in zero-grav gardens. Elders traced star lines in the air with luminous fingers. And then, fire. Metal ships broke the sky like blades, screams, the hum of orbital disintegration beams. Bodies fell in silence, pulverized before they could run. The footage cut sharply. Another angle. Holding pens. Cryotanks marked with numbers. Infants, drugged and tagged. Women, shackled and sorted like inventory. Seyla stared, unmoving. Raylan said nothing. He didn't need to. Some truths didn't require commentary. Then, a final Klepa, high-level memo between Imperial mineral agents. Lasari clearance complete. Moon veins opened. Organic interference minimal. That was all. Her people weren't a threat. They were a resource. And she alive only because someone mislabeled her pod. Seyla sank to her knees, slowly, as if gravity had doubled. Her hands covered her mouth, but no sound came. Her shoulders shook not with rage, but with the weight of memory returning too fast. She had dreamed they were gone, yes, but dreams were gentle lies. This was truth, crystalline and sharp, slicing deep. Raylan moved to her side but didn't reach for her. He waited. Then, through the stillness, her voice rose. Not words, not language. A sound soft, melodic, impossibly ancient. It filled the room like mist, curling around them, embedding itself into the metal, the wires, the silence. A Lasari morning hymn, sung only when stars were lost. Raylan had heard many things in ware explosions, orders, the silence of empty halls, but never this. It wasn't a song, it was a wound opening in harmony. Her tone rose, fractured, dipped again, echoing through the chamber, as though the room itself remembered her people. The machines flickered, picking up resonance, reacting. The floor trembled slightly beneath them, not from force, but recognition. The song ended not with a climax, but a breath, a release, a stillness that felt final. Raylan spoke quietly. They lied to us all. Seyla turned, tear tracks glowing faintly along her cheeks, silver blue like her skin. Her voice, now steady, was low. They didn't lie to you, she said. They turned you into the lie. Raylan looked down. She didn't say it with malice, just truth. But now, she continued, you're unraveling it, thread by thread. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she stood no longer trembling, no longer burdened by doubt. Something had shifted in her. The past was still a blade, but now, it was one she would wield, not one she would bleed beneath. She looked to Raylan. You saw this and still helped me. He nodded. I needed to know the truth, even if it broke me. It hasn't, she said softly. It changed you. Outside the archive, the ship carried on voices in corridors, reports echoing, protocols enforced. But in this buried vault, something had awakened that no empire could code, breed, or suppress. They stepped out together, not as prisoner and soldier, not as man and myth, but as witnesses, and in that perhaps as something more. Not enemies of the empire, but of the silence it fed upon. The sirens didn't just scream, they howled, like something ancient and wrong had been disturbed. Red strobes pulsed along the narrow corridors, painting walls in violent flashes, slicing through the dark with mechanical urgency. Every klaxon was a countdown. Every footstep echoing down the corridor was a reminder that time, whatever of it they had left, was unraveling fast. Raylan's breath was sharp in his throat, not panicked, controlled. He moved with the precision of a soldier who had broken every rule and burned every bridge, and now had nothing left to protect but the soul he had just reclaimed. Behind him, Seyla ran in silence, her steps lighter than they should have been, her eyes fixed forward not with fear, but purpose. They didn't speak. Words would have wasted air. They reached the loading bay. Doors loomed like the mouth of a slumbering beast, sealed, and then, with a code pulled from Raylan's stolen access key, one hissed open. The noise it made was too loud, too late to undo. They slipped inside. The hangar was enormous, a hollowed cathedral of steel and fire. Ships slept in their berths, some gleaming with imperial polish, others rusting at the seams. Overhead, mechanical arms moved like giant insects. The air buzzed with ozone and threat. Raylan pointed. There, he said, already moving. The scout ship was small, sleek and remarkable to the naked eye, but fast, built for smuggling messages through war zones. It was their only hope. Not freedom, not yet, just the possibility of it. As they neared the ramp, Seyla slowed. Her hand brushed the edge of the hull. She didn't look at him when she whispered, "She knows me." Raylan blinked, but didn't question it. She wasn't talking about memory. She was talking about recognition. The kind no human command line could code. Inside, the ship was cold and waiting. The console flickered to life the moment her fingers touched it. Lights rose, soft and responsive, like it had been expecting her. Outside, the alarm changed pitch. Sharp, final. "They're sealing the bay," Raylan muttered. "We've got 90 seconds." He moved toward the weapons station. She stayed at the helm. The screen in front of her shimmered, then shifted. Not maps, not charts. Stars. They weren't coordinates. They were constellations drawn by instinct, memory, song. She sang, low and rhythmic, a tone that resonated deep in the controls. The system responded not to commands, but to harmony. Lines traced themselves across the display, forming a path through space that no Imperial navigator could read. "I thought you needed coordinates," Raylan said, watching her with quiet awe. "I don't," she replied. "I need the stars to remember me." The engines roared to life. Behind them, the hangar doors began to close, massive plates grinding down with agonizing finality. "Strap in," she whispered. He didn't question, just did. The ship moved like it had waited its whole life to fly. They burst forward, scraping against metal, sparks flaring across the viewports. From behind, shouts filled the bay, blaster fire cracked through the air, but they were already lifting, already soaring. Raylan fired a volley behind them. Not to kill, only to scatter. "We're not clear," he growled. "Debris field up ahead." "I see it," she said calmly. And she did. The field wasn't status, it shifted, twisted, a living graveyard of broken machines and shattered hulls, still spinning with the momentum of battles long ended. Raylan's jaw clenched. "No one pilots through that?" "No one," she answered. "But she wasn't one of us." Seyla didn't steer with her hands. She moved with her breath, guiding the ship with gestures that looked more like dancing than navigation. Her skin glowed faintly, a soft shimmer of silver blue beneath the control lights, and the stars outside shifted as if parting for her. Raylan glanced back at the field. Metal spun like knives, fragments of ships and frozen bodies caught in slow, deadly ballet. He looked at her. "Why help me?" he asked, the question he hadn't dared until now. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained locked on the stars, hands hovering just above the panel, not touching but communing. Then, softly, her words spilled into the hum of the ship. "Because you were never meant to serve the machine that built this prison. You were meant to question it, and I was never meant to be a prisoner." She turned to him. "I was born to navigate the stars." He stared at her, not as an alien, not as a myth, but as something older than both, something lost, and now reawakened. The ship twisted through the debris like a thread through a needle, narrowly dodging twisted beams, skipping over burning cores, slicing between frozen bodies that once dreamed of freedom and never found it. Their ship emerged, alive, untouched. The silence hit first, then the black. Seyla exhaled and slumped back. Raylan didn't speak. He couldn't. There were no words for what she'd just done, what they had just done. The Empire had given him a weapon. Instead, he found a navigator who remembered the way home. And now, the Starzan's maps of conquest had become something else entirely. Refuge. And maybe, if they dared, revolution. The stars were gone. Or maybe not gone, just hidden, veiled behind the stormlight of a gas giant so immense it swallowed the sky. Their stolen ship floated in silence beneath that swollen colossus, tucked into its shadow like a secret, wrapped in ribbons of magnetized aurora and the slow pulse of planetary breath. Inside, everything was still. Not the stillness of peace, but the kind that follows escape, when adrenaline drains and silence becomes deafening. When survival feels like borrowed time. Raylan sat slumped against the bulkhead, a dark stain spreading along the side of his shirt. Plasma grays. Not fatal, but close enough to remind him how fragile he was now, how mortal rebellion made you. He didn't cry out, didn't curse. But Seyla saw it, the pain in the way he clenched his jaw, in the tremble he tried to hide. She knelt beside him, fingers already moving with quiet focus, pulling open the med kit she had modified with tools not found in human hands. She didn't ask permission. She simply worked. Her touch was precise, not cold, not warm, just steady like starlight filtered through crystal. She mixed powders that shimmered like crushed pearl, oils that gave off faint ultraviolet glow, all while whispering words in a language Raylan didn't recognize but instinctively knew had been spoken long before Earth had discovered fire. When she pressed the salve to his wound, he flinched, not from the pain, but from the heated, unnatural warmth that moved through him like memory. It stung, then numbed, then bloomed outward, as if something in his body remembered a kind of healing it had never known. "What is that?" he breathed. Lasari bloom root, she said softly. Harvested only during lunar eclipse. Mixed with morning ash. We used it when our singers were burned. She didn't look up. Her voice remained steady, but something in it cracked around the edges. Raylan reached up, touched her hand. Thank you. She met his gaze. There was a pause, then quiet, long, sacred. No engines, no voices. Just the sound of their breath and the distant hum of systems keeping them alive. Seyla stood and moved to the small galley. She returned with 2 cups. Steam rose from them, curling through the dim red emergency lights like spirit trails. Something rich, earthy, not standard ration brew. He took the cup, sipped, and coughed. What is this? Her smile for once was genuine. Fermented moonsap, not for humans apparently. He coughed again, wiped his mouth, then grinned. It's terrible. I know. They laughed. Not loud, not long, just enough. Enough to prove they still could. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching but not quite leaning. The air between them had changed, no longer held taut by tension or the Empire's chains or fear. Something else pulsed there, now unspoken, alive. You didn't have to save me, he said quietly. No, she agreed. Why did you? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the ceiling as if it were the stars she missed and not the false metal sky above them. You didn't see me as a body, she said at last. You saw me. And that matters? To me, yes. To the stars? Maybe not, but I don't care about them right now. Her fingers grazed his, lightly at first, then stayed. When he turned to face her, she was already closer than before. The light caught her skin, still glowing faintly from the medicine, from the escape, from something deeper inside her that no scanner could read. Raylan's breath hitched. Seyla? She leaned in slowly, giving him every chance to turn away. He didn't. Their lips met not with desperation, but with understanding. Soft, slow, a question answered with another question. He tasted moonsap and starlight. She felt the roughness of a soldier's hand wrapped in gentleness he thought he'd forgotten. They kissed again. Longer this time. When they parted, he rested his forehead to hers, as if grounding himself in her breath. You sure? He asked. Her voice came low, fierce, certain. This time, I choose. He didn't press. He didn't claim. He simply held her. And when their bodies came together, it wasn't lust. It was recognition of 2 souls altered by violence and grief, reaching towards something fragile and astonishing in the dark. He moved slowly, reverently, like she was a hymn made flesh. She met him with a grace that made his hands tremble. There were no cries, no gasps, only the rhythm of closeness, the heat of breath against skin, the miracle of being wanted without demand. Time lost its grip. Only sensation remained. And when they lay together afterward entwined, half covered in the emergency blanket, they didn't speak for a long while. Outside, the gas giant rolled endlessly in silence. But inside, something had shifted. Not just between them. Within them, a part of him he thought long dead now beat quietly behind his ribs. A part of her long buried beneath pain now glowed softly, anchored not by duty, but by choice. They hadn't escaped the Empire. Not yet. But for the first time, they had found each other. And that, in itself, was a kind of freedom. The asteroid field of Nymara spun in silence, cloaked in shadows and whispers. From a distance, it looked like chaos, a tumble of rock and ice drifting in blind obedience to gravity's cruel ballet. But inside that fractured veil, there was order, there was life, and there was war. Their stolen scout ship pierced the field with careful precision, slipping through jagged rocks and ancient wreckage, guided not by charts but by a coded signal. It was faint, barely detectable beneath layers of noise, but Seyla had found it. She always did. The beacon pulsed 3 times, then vanished. A seam opened in the dark. The hangar was carved directly into the belly of an asteroid, masked from scanners, hidden from time. As their vessel touched down, a low vibration moved through the floor, part mechanical, part something older, something biological. Raylan felt it in his bones before the hatch even opened. When it did, they were met not by soldiers but by silence. Watchful eyes, Tall figures cloaked in patchwork armor and worn resistance coats. No insignias, no polished boots, just survivors. The Wanderers. Raylan's hand instinctively twitched toward his weapon, but Seyla touched his arm, barely a whisper of contact, and the tension dropped from his shoulders like a discarded shell. A woman stepped forward, half her face marked by burn scars, the other lined by time and judgment. She studied them both without speaking. Her gaze lingered on Seyla for a long moment before it softened just slightly. "You're the ones who cracked the protocol server," she said at last. Her voice was rough, sandpaper over stone. Raylan nodded. "You're the ones who made the Empire bleed without firing a shot." "We didn't plan it," he replied. "No one ever does," she said, turning. "Come, you've started something. Now you have to see what it's become." They followed her into the heart of the base. It was not a military fortress, it was a shelter. A home patched together from the bones of fallen ships and the breath of those who refused to die. Children played beside engine coils. Elders whispered songs in alien tongues. Defected officers tended hydroponic plants alongside former slaves. It wasn't orderly, it wasn't clean, but it was free. The corridors were alive with murmur swords like Raylan, leak, proof, passing through mouths like wildfire. He heard pieces of his own story told back to him, reshaped, retold, growing larger than truth. He didn't stop them. Let them believe. They reached the central chamber, a high-vaulted dome flickering with dusty light. A hologram hovered in the middle of the room, faded outlines of outer sectors, colored with rebellion. Dozens of red markers blinked like heartbeats. His leak had spread, farther than he ever imagined. Entire systems were rising, not with weapons, but with knowing. Seyla stood near the edge of the display, watching the map not as a strategist, but as something more primal. Her hand slipped into his. He felt her tremble. She turned to him slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she placed his palm against her stomach. It was subtle, the swell barely noticeable, but the truth hit harder than gunfire. "I didn't think I could," she whispered. "Not after the stasis, not after the drugs. But I can feel it." His fingers tightened gently, reverently. "Seyla?" Her voice shook, but not with fear. "This child is proof that their system isn't perfect, that even under their chains, something natural, something real can survive, grow." The silence around them thickened. One of the Wanderers, the scarred woman, stepped forward. "You're carrying a hybrid," she said, not unkindly. "The Empire will hunt you both until you bleed starlight." "I know," Seyla replied, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "But they won't take this from me. Not again." Raylan's arm wrapped around her waist. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just stood there, beside her, holding the future in both hands. The Wanderers nodded. No applause, no celebration, just quiet recognition. A line had been crossed. A new page had turned. And though the Empire still moved like a beast in the dark, for the first time, it bled from a wound it couldn't cauterize. A child, not bred in captivity, but born from choice, from defiance, from love. The facility was buried deep beneath a dead moon where nothing grew, where the soil reeked of iron and silence. Its entrance was carved into a cliffside scar, long forgotten on Imperial records, accessible only by encrypted coordinates, and the kind of desperation that made men ghosts. Raylan led the team in through a breach, barely wide enough for a man in armor. Their boots sank into dust, the air thin and dry, like the place had never been meant for breath. The metal walls were blackened, scorched in places by time or by intention. One could tell anymore. No lights, no sentries, but it wasn't abandoned. It was sleeping. The squad moved with precision, 3 Wanderers, with eyes like old wolves. Weapons at the ready, breath controlled. Seyla was the last to enter, her fingers grazing the wall like she could read it by touch alone. The pulse of the place was wrong, she said. Not dead, but humming with buried rhythm, as if the walls still remembered the purpose they were built for. The map had been clear. This was the last known Imperial birthing plant, a facility where forced breeding programs had been perfected, refined, weaponized. Raylan had seen diagrams, schematics, reports of offspring engineered for obedience, loyalty, and war. But seeing it was different. The corridor opened into a chamber unlike any other, wide, circular, encased in shadow. Stasis pods lined the walls like tombs stacked to the sky. Hundreds of them, maybe more, each held a child. Not fetus, not embryo, children. Suspended mid-dream, unmoving, their small bodies floating in pale blue suspension fluid, wires embedded into their spines, their temples, their hearts. Some were human, some weren't. Some were something in between, eyes too large, skin faintly luminous, patterns that didn't follow any species Raylan knew. And yet, they all breathed in rhythm, slow, controlled, chained in sleep. Seyla stopped in the center of the room. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She listened. And then, she sang. The note was soft. Not a melody, not a word, but a tone deep, ancient, resonant. It spread through the chamber like warm air displacing cold. Lights flickered in the walls, then steadied. The nearest pods blinked to life. Monitors pulsed green, and then one of the children opened their eyes. Raylan stepped forward, hand reaching instinctively toward his weapon, but froze. The child inside didn't scream. They reached out, palm against glass. Not begging, just aware. The others followed, slowly. Lights blooming like fireflies trapped in crystal. Dozens, then hundreds. All waking, all watching. Raylan's calm crackled. One of the wanderers whispered, "We've got charges set. 10 minutes to blow the core." Raylan didn't respond. His eyes were locked on a little girl no older than 5, her skin soft violet, her eyes human, but not quite. She looked at him with recognition he couldn't explain. And when Seyla took his hand, he felt her trembling. "Raylan," she said, voice raw, "they're not experiments. They're not tools. They're children, and they were never given a choice." He looked to her, then back to the pods. The mission was clear: destroy the facility, erase the last trace of the Empire's breeding legacy, burn it all. But fire wouldn't free them. He spoke into the calm, firm, final. "Abort demolition." "What, Captain?" "Abort. We're not erasing this. We're rescuing it." The silence on the line was thick. Then a click. Acknowledgement. Raylan moved to the nearest terminal, fingers dancing across keys he barely understood. Seyla knelt beside a pod, hands on the seal, still humming low. The fluid began to drain. The first child collapsed into her arms, breathing, blinking, light clinging to their skin like morning dew. Seyla looked at Raylan. "No empire," she whispered, "can own what is loved freely." And in that moment, he understood. The Empire's power had never been in its ships, its armies, or its weapons. It was in control and the manipulation of life itself. And in this room, they had tried to bend creation to their will. But now, in the quiet ruin of that chamber, the truth stirred. Love uncommanded, uncalculated had broken in. And the children were waking. They were running out of time. The tunnel groaned around them, not from stress, but from the screams of gunfire reverberating in the steel above, closer, sharper, angrier. The rebels were falling. The children were behind Seyla, clustered in warmth and fear, too young to understand that freedom demanded something ancient and cruel in return. The lights overhead blinked like a dying pulse. Red, white, red. Emergency strobes painted her skin in ghostlight as she turned toward him, her body trembling, not from fear, but from knowledge. She knew what he was about to do. She felt it before he spoke. Raylan placed the access key in her hand. It was warm from his palm, slightly damp from sweat. He didn't meet her eyes right away. Not because he couldn't, but because if he did, he wouldn't let go. "You know the route. Nimra's secondary jump gate is still cold. If you move fast, they won't catch the signal spike. You'll be clear." "You said we would be clear," she answered, her voice a whisper, half cry, half song. He pulled her close, arms wrapped tight around the curve of her spine, as if by pressure alone he could tattoo the moment into memory. Her head rested against his chest, and she felt the stagger in his heartbeat. It was steady, but slowing. "I'm buying time," he murmured, lips brushing the top of her hair. "You're carrying something bigger than either of us. He needs to live. You both do." He touched her stomach, reverent, careful, like it was made of starlight and hope. "Keep him safe," he said. "Make him free." Then, almost bashfully, he smiled, wounded and whole all at once. She tried to stop him. Her hands clung to his wrists. Her voice cracked. "Number, there has to be another way. We can fight together. You said you'd never." "I said I was afraid of silence," he cut in gently. "And I am. That's why I'm making noise now." The echo of approaching boots grew louder. The soldiers were coming, armor-clad, faceless, merciless. The Empire didn't forget. It didn't forgive. Raylan kissed her once, slow and deep and final. No promises, just truth. Then he turned, sealing the door with his access code as she screamed his name, muffled behind reinforced glass. Alone now. He checked his weapon, low on charge. He adjusted his stance. And then he reached into his jacket and pulled out the last card they hadn't played the message chip. It wasn't much, but it carried the truth. With trembling fingers, he jammed it into the emergency beacon terminal, overloading the encryption, sending the signal out on every frequency he could hijack. A broadcast not just to rebels, but to farmers, smugglers, outcasts, and dreamers. The Empire's lie, exposed. The children, the experiments, the forbidden love between species that bred not monsters, but miracles. He spoke to the stars. "If you hear this, we're not broken. We are not machines. We are more than bloodlines and orders. We are memory. We are choice. We are the ones they tried to silence, and we are not done." The door behind him blew open. The soldiers stepped through, weapons raised. Raylan didn't flinch. His hand was still on the terminal. The signal was still sending. And in that final moment, as their rifles fired, his eyes weren't on them, they were looking past them, far beyond steel and flame. To the stars. To her. And to the child that would carry his name, his defiance, and his freedom into a future they could never cage. The wind on Novia didn't howl, it whispered. Through tall blossoms with translucent petals that shimmered like stardust. Through trees whose branches bent like they remembered gravity from another world. And in the center of that garden, where time slowed and wounds forgot how to bleed, a child laughed. His laughter was unbroken music. Wild, untamed. A sound that didn't belong to sorrow or war. It belonged only to now. Seyla sat beneath a flowering tree, her eyes closed, one hand stroking the damp earth, the other resting lightly over her chest. It had been 3 cycles since the tunnels. 3 years since blood soaked Raylan's hands, since his name vanished from rebel records, since his voice became legend and then silence. But his child lived. He ran barefoot, chasing a creature made of light and wings that danced through the tall, wind-blown grass. Other children hybrids, not hidden anymore, played nearby. Different eyes, different skin, but all laughing the same, all raised by those who remembered captivity and chose freedom anyway. Seyla had grown fuller, stronger. Her back no longer curled with shame. Her voice, once confined to morning hymns, now filled the air in quiet hum songs that coaxed seeds to grow faster, songs that soothed children to sleep. But today, the void stirred. The wind shifted. The garden lights flickered not from malfunction, but from something older, a resonance that vibrated not in machines, but in bone. She stood. The air turned thick with memory. Something shimmered at the edge of the settlement's perimeter, just static at first. A ripple in the projected sky. Then a voice. Not shouting, not screaming, just speaking. "Freedom sings in every star you saved." She froze. It couldn't be. Her heart stumbled inside her. Her hand clutched the pendant around her neck, the one forged from the broken collar Raylan had removed all those years ago. The voice repeated, "Freedom sings in every star you saved." It was him. His voice didn't sound tired, didn't sound broken. It sounded transformed. As if he'd passed through fire, darkness, and Moran came out tempered, refined, purposeful. The transmission wasn't traced. It came from no known channel. It arrived in her bones before it arrived in any antenna. She dropped to her knees. The child came running, sensing something bigger than words. He climbed into her lap, silent. His small hands found her cheeks, wet with tears. She looked into his eyes, his father's eyes, and smiled through the salt and shock. Then she sang. The song didn't mourn. It didn't weep. It rose like the slow unfurling of dawn, gentle and warm, wrapping around the garden like a veil. The earth responded. Flowers opened early, the leaves swayed in rhythm, and the sky false, or not deepened, to a deeper blue. Rebirth wasn't an explosion. It was this. A mother singing not because she lost, but because she had something left to give. A boy, born from rebellion, bathed in music. And across the void, somewhere light years beyond reach, Raylan listened. Alive. Changed. Still fighting, but never again alone. The Council Hall of Novia stood not as a monument to power, but as a garden of glass and starlight. Its ceiling breathed transparent, curving into the cosmos above, where stars blinked like forgotten promises finally remembered. The floor hummed softly under bare feet. No one wore uniforms here. Only memory, only truth. Seyla stood at the center of the chamber, her silhouette backlit by the quiet galaxy that had once tried to silence her. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't afraid. Her robes were simple, silver-lined and open at the shoulders, bearing the soft glow of a constellation tattoo that pulsed just beneath her skin, each star inked where her people had fallen, each line drawn where hope had grown roots. Hundreds filled the chamber, representatives of once fractured colonies, hybrid children grown into leaders, humans who had defected not for politics, but for something older, something sacred, choice. Seyla inhaled, and when she spoke, the hall stilled not out of fear, but reverence. We were told that freedom was dangerous, that it had to be contained, cataloged, or rewritten, that our songs were noise, that our blood was flawed, that our wombs were property. She paused, gaze sweeping slowly across the crowd, resting on those who bore the scars and didn't bother hiding them. But freedom isn't a treaty, or a weapon, or a throne. It is a breath taken without permission, a kiss shared without fear, a child carried because you choose to bring light into the dark. She turned slightly, motioning toward a small pedestal. Her son stepped forward taller now, his face sharp with his father's cheekbones but softened by her eyes. In his hands, a crystalline torch, flickering with blue flame. He looked at her, and she nodded once. Then he turned and raised the flame high toward the dome. A quiet gasp rippled through the chamber as one star above shimmered brighter than the rest, newly born, freshly named. Raylan. Its name glowed in ancient Lasari script, etched across the heavens. A whisper moved through the room like wind through long grass. This story began with a cage, Seyla said, her voice trembling but sure, but ends in Constellation. Silence. Then breath. Then a single note sung, not by her but by a child in the back row. A hum, tentative at first, uncertain, until another joined. Then another. Until it became a song. Not of mourning, but of arrival. Of rebirth. Of memory that refused to bow. In that moment, Seyla closed her eyes. She no longer needed to speak. The room sang for her. The people had their voice. And the empire, once etched into skin and sky, had crumbled not from rebellion, but from resonance. Love had rewritten the code. Not in battlefields, but in lullabies, in choices, in hands held across species, across scars, across time. Outside, Novia's twin suns aligned for just a breath. And in that light, every lie of the old world turned to dust. Above them, the new constellation glowed. Permanent, undeniable, free, and so it ended. Not with an explosion, not with a throne toppling from fire, but with a name whispered across starlight. Raylan. He didn't win a war. He rewrote the meaning of resistance. He didn't shatter the empire with weapons. He shattered it with choice. Seyla chose to love. She chose to sing. She chose freedom when the galaxy had forgotten it existed. And their child? Born of two worlds. Proof that obedience can be unlearned. That even in the darkest systems, life finds a way to shine. A single act of defiance became a constellation. Now, the question remains. What if love was always the weapon they feared most? This was only one voice, one story among stars. But if you believe the galaxy holds more truths, more forbidden bonds, buried histories, and impossible love, then you haven't heard the last from Alien Chronicles. Subscribe, return, because out here, the silence is never empty. It's waiting for the next voice to rise.